I used to believe silence could keep the peace, that if I stayed small, polite, and careful enough, the storm in that house would never touch me. For years, I smiled through the dinners, nodded through the insults, pretended not to notice how every kindness I gave was met with condescension dressed as concern. But that night, when he laughed at me in front of everyone, his words sharp, deliberate, and practiced, I felt something inside me give way. It wasn't rage. It was clarity. The kind that comes when you finally understand no amount of patience will make cruelty respect you. My name is Laurel Whitford, and I have spent a lifetime earning the right to be quiet. But after that night, I realized quiet is what let them believe they could get away with everything. They still think I'll keep their secrets. They have no idea how close they are to watching their world come undone. The applause rolled like waves, steady, rehearsed, and hollow. I sat among rows of pressed uniforms and polished medals, a silent ornament in the front section. The hall smelled of starch and brass, the air too clean, too proud. On the stage, Admiral Raymond Whitford, my father-in-law, stood tall under the lights, his medals catching every camera flash. He spoke with the cadence of a man long accustomed to being obeyed. Every word, duty, sacrifice, honor, fell like commandments from a pulpit. Beside him, my husband, Ethan, mirrored his posture perfectly. Shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes forward, two versions of the same man, one molded by pride, the other by fear of disappointing it. I'd seen that posture at our dinner table, in the mirror of our marriage, and in every photo that hung on the walls of our home. When the speech neared its end, Raymond paused. The cameras tightened their focus, hungry for his closing line. Then, casually, he turned his head toward me. I felt the shift in the room before he spoke, the kind of silence that smells like smoke right before the fire. His smile was small, polished, and cruel. Some people, he said, wear the uniform just long enough to prove why they never should have. Laughter erupted, polite, obedient laughter, the kind people give when they don't understand the joke but know they should play along. I sat perfectly still. I didn't flinch, didn't blink. The sound of that laughter crawled under my skin and settled somewhere between my ribs. Ethan's eyes dropped to the floor. The applause started again, thunderous and clean, washing over me like acid rain. I remember thinking, this is how a person disappears, not in one moment of violence, but in the small, public betrayals that no one calls by their name. After the ceremony, the officers clustered around him, hands outstretched, words of admiration flowing like a script they all knew by heart. Raymond accepted each compliment as if they were owed. His voice filled the air, confident and charming, and I realized it wasn't just authority that made people listen. It was their need to believe in the myth of him. I slipped out through a side door. The sunlight was too sharp, the sky painfully blue. The wind off the bay bit through the thin fabric of my dress. A helicopter passed overhead, the rotors chopping the air into violent rhythm. I looked up, the sound vibrating in my chest, familiar and foreign all at once. Years ago, I'd lived by that sound, the deep thrum that meant someone was coming home or someone was lost forever. But standing there, I felt neither, just the weight of all the years I'd spent keeping still while other people rewrote the story of my life. Inside, applause echoed again, muffled by the walls. I could picture Raymond at the podium, the cameras capturing his smile, the medals on his chest glowing under the lights, a living monument to a truth he didn't earn. Ethan came out a few minutes later, his jacket slung over one arm. He didn't meet my eyes. "Laurel," he said quietly, "Dad didn't mean, don't." The word left my mouth calm, steady. It was the first time I'd stopped protecting him from his own cowardice. He hesitated, as if waiting for me to soften, when I didn't. He exhaled, turned, and walked back inside, back to the applause that always seemed to need him more than I did. I stayed on the steps, hands trembling though I didn't feel cold. For years, I had convinced myself that endurance was a kind of peace, that silence was a way to survive people who mistook cruelty for discipline. But watching the flags whip in the wind and hearing my name turned into a punchline, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger that came first. It was exhaustion, the kind that strips fear from your bones and leaves only clarity behind. I thought of the night in the control tower, of voices begging through static, of orders that silenced them, of my own name buried under his report. I had forgiven because it was easier than fighting an entire system that bowed to him. But now, as I looked toward the open sky above the bay, I knew forgiveness had run out. Behind me, the crowd cheered again. Raymond must have stepped down from the podium, shaking more hands, collecting more praise. I listened to the sound fade into the wind, into the steady hum of aircraft engines from somewhere beyond the horizon. My palms itched, the way they used to before a mission, restless, certain, the kind of certainty that doesn't need permission. I turned toward the parking lot, the sun glinting off windshields like tiny mirrors. My reflection passed through each one, fractured and momentary, 1,000 versions of me watching myself leave. For years, I'd stayed quiet because I believed truth was too heavy to carry alone. But silence, I realized, was heavier. It sank everything it touched. By the time I reached my car, the noise from the ceremony had faded completely. Only the wind remained, pushing against my shoulders, urging me forward. I paused, fingers tight around the door handle, and took one last look at the white tents fluttering in the distance. They had celebrated a man who built his life on other people's silence. He still thought mine was part of the foundation, but the ground beneath him had already started to crack. After the ceremony, the family gathered at the Whitford estate on the bay in Virginia, a house that looked more like a monument than a home. Every hallway bore portraits of Raymond in uniform, one for each rank he'd ever held. His presence filled every frame, every polished surface, every breath of air. Even the servants spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb his shadow. Dinner that evening felt like a formal briefing. The table was long enough for 12, though only 5 of us sat there, Raymond at the head, Marianne beside him, Ethan and I across from each other, and an empty seat no one ever dared occupy. The candles flickered, the wine shone dark against crystal, and the silence was so heavy it almost had form. Raymond began, as he always did, with a monologue. The world, according to him, had softened. Men lacked grit, discipline was dead, and respect was a relic of better generations. His voice carried the weight of command even here, in his own dining room. I cut my steak into small, perfect pieces, listening as I always had, nodding at the appropriate pauses. Then, without meaning to, I heard myself ask, calm but unshaken, "Do you think legacy is about truth? Or just control?" The knife in Raymond's hand stopped mid-air. The air in the room seemed to shift. Marianne's fork clinked against her plate. She forced a thin smile. "Laurel, dear, we don't talk shop at dinner." Raymond didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on me, steady and unblinking. "A true Whitford," he said finally, "knows when to stay silent." Beneath the table, Ethan's hand found my leg, a small, desperate plea to let it go. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides both fear and defiance, because I suddenly understood. Silence wasn't virtue in this house, it was obedience. When dinner ended, Raymond rose first, as always. His chair scraped the hardwood, echoing like a command. He excused himself for a call, leaving behind his wineglass half full and a small silver key resting on the mahogany table beside the decanter. Marianne didn't notice. Ethan didn't either. But I did. I waited until the house quieted, until footsteps faded upstairs and the antique clock ticked past midnight. Then I slipped out of bed, bare feet soundless on the cold floor, and made my way toward the library. The long corridor was lined with old naval maps and sepia photographs of men standing on ship decks, eyes bright with belief. I wondered how many of them had died for his orders. The key fit perfectly into the heavy oak door at the end of the hall. Inside, a faint smell of dust and metal hung in the air. This was the room Raymond called the Hall of Legacy. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, labeled boxes stacked with precise handwriting, years, operations, commendations. In the corner, half hidden under a draped flag, was a metal safe. The words engraved on the front read, USS Hawthorne, Classified Materials. I hesitated only once before turning the key. Inside lay an old external drive and a stack of yellowed reports bound with string. The top page read in faded ink, Operation Fireline, 2011. My throat tightened. I took the drive to Raymond's desk, plugging it into his old laptop. The machine hummed awake, a faint light spilling across the dark wood. One folder blinked on the screen. Audio log 4B, Fireline in 23.42 hours. I clicked play, static, wind, the sharp rattle of metal. Then a voice, Raymond's voice, steady, clipped, familiar. Abort rescue, visibility 0, no retrieval. Another voice broke through, urgent, almost pleading. Sir, survivors still transmitting. We report it mechanical. I froze, every breath caught in my throat. I had heard those words before, through radio static and storm, the night 9 men disappeared into black water. I had believed the failure was mine. I had lived with that shame like a second skin. But hearing his voice now, the authority, the calculation, it ripped through me like cold steel. Behind me, the door creaked. I turned. Ethan stood there, the dim light cutting across his face. His eyes dropped to the screen, then to my shaking hands. Don't, he said softly, crossing the room. He reached past me and pulled the drive free. You'll destroy him, and us. I stared at him. You mean you've always known? He swallowed hard. He's my father. He left before I could speak again. The sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. I sat there alone, staring at the dark screen, the echo of Raymond's voice still hanging in the room. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I thought about how easily men like him rewrote history, and how easily others helped them do it. Later, after the house went still again, I returned to the desk. My pulse pounded in my ears. I opened the report file and scrolled to the final page. At the bottom, in handwriting, different from the rest, was a single note scrawled in blue ink. Supplemental recording filed to Delta Tracker. Transfer initiated. I whispered the words aloud. Supplemental recording. Delta Tracker. Someone had made a second copy. Someone who knew. I stared at the line until the letters blurred. My fingers trembled as I closed the file. Heart pounding with a strange, burning clarity. It wasn't just about a lie anymore. It was about every year stolen from me. Every truth buried under his reputation. Every nod of compliance that kept him untouchable. Upstairs, the house slept in silence. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch as I stepped out of the library, the silver key still warm in my palm. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small walking through this house. The air no longer smelled of polish and pride. It smelled of rot beneath the varnish. By morning, I knew what I had to do. Someone, somewhere, had preserved the truth, and I intended to find them. The name Delta Tracker wouldn't leave my mind. I'd repeated it silently all night, the words looping with every heartbeat. By morning, I had a plan. I searched old records, veterans directories, conference rosters, anything that still linked to Operation Fireline. Only one name surfaced more than once. Captain Marjorie Holt. Her last recorded address was in Norfolk, 200 miles south. The note beside it read, Retired. Logistics Coordinator. I called the number listed under her name, unsure what to expect. The line rang twice before an older woman's voice answered. If it's about Fireline, she said, come alone. The line went dead. Norfolk looked gray even under the sunlight. The kind of town where the sea wind stripped the paint off everything that stood too close to the water. I parked by the boardwalk, the air thick with salt and rust, and followed the address into a narrow street lined with small, weather-beaten houses. Marjorie's home was near the dunes. White siding faded to ivory, wind chimes made from old bullet casings swaying in the breeze. She opened the door before I could knock. Her hair was silver, her shoulders straight, eyes the color of wet stone. "You were the young one," she said. "The only woman on that mission." I nodded. She let me in without another word. The living room smelled faintly of coffee and engine grease. The walls were covered in framed photographs, squadrons, air crews, half-smiling faces in flight suits. A shelf near the window held model helicopters, each tagged with a name. Some names were underlined in black marker. Those were the ones who never came back. Marjorie moved slowly to a cabinet, pulling out a small, charred metal device. She set it on the table between us. "This is the Delta tracker," she said. It never synced to the Navy mainframe. It holds the real flight path. The device was scarred and dented, but the label was still legible. I stared at it, feeling a strange hum under my skin, like memory trying to claw its way out of the dark. "Why didn't you turn it in?" I asked. She leaned back, her expression tired. "Because those who tried didn't live long enough to testify." The words landed heavy. She told me about a journalist who'd begun investigating Fireline years ago, a woman who'd written to a few survivors, asking questions about the mission. Her car exploded in 2014. The official report called it an accidental fuel leak. Another man, a Navy technician, had fallen from a pier during a storm before he could give his statement. "It's not just buried truth," Marjorie said. "It's guarded." I reached for the Delta tracker. It was cold, heavier than I expected. Holding it felt like touching something sacred and cursed at once, a relic of the night everything went wrong. "You want to know what kind of man your father-in-law really is?" she asked quietly. "Play the last minute." She slid a laptop toward me, the screen already open to a folder labeled Recovered Logs. I clicked on the last file. The room filled with static, wind, and distant shouting. A young male voice came through. "Commander Whitford is still out there." Then a pause. The next voice froze my breath. Calm, authoritative, absolute. "If she refuses, cut her line. We can't lose another chopper for one woman's mistake." I stared at the screen, waiting for it to end. The audio clicked off abruptly, replaced by the hum of the laptop's fan. I couldn't speak. For years, I had believed my fall had been a consequence of bad weather, a mechanical failure, the chaos of command. But this was deliberate. He hadn't just abandoned me, he'd given the order. Marjorie's eyes stayed on me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The image of him standing at that dinner table, wine glass raised, lecturing about obedience, a true Whitford knows when to stay silent, played over and over in my head until I felt sick. I whispered, more to myself than to her. "He tried to kill me." She didn't deny it. Instead, she pushed a file envelope across the table. Inside were copies of reports, radio logs, and photos of the wreckage I'd never seen. "You'll find proof in there," she said. "But proof won't be enough. You'll have to decide what you want it to cost." I folded the envelope, my hands trembling. As I stood, I noticed an email printout pinned to her wall, yellowed with age. The subject line read, "They lied about Fireline." My stomach dropped. That same subject line had appeared in my inbox years ago, from a name I didn't recognize. I had ignored it, assuming it was another conspiracy theory. I had never even opened it. Outside, the sky over Norfolk had turned a dull, heavy gray. The wind carried the smell of rain and salt. I thanked Marjorie quietly and stepped back into the cold air. Down by the dunes. The tide was rising, waves crashing against the wooden posts. The gulls screamed overhead, circling in the mist. I thought of the men who died that night, their last transmissions fading into static while I fought to keep the chopper steady. I thought of Raymond's voice, calm in the storm, giving the order that erased them, and me. The water looked endless, merciless. I felt it in my chest. The same cold certainty I'd felt standing on that runway years ago when the signal cut out. The same certainty that the truth once heard, couldn't be unheard. I turned back toward the road, wind stinging my face, in my pocket. The Delta tracker felt like a heartbeat, small, steady, alive. He had built an empire on silence, on metals polished with other people's pain. But standing there, with the sea roaring behind me, I knew that silence had finally run out of places to hide. Not anymore. I whispered into the wind. The words vanished into the salt air, carried toward the horizon where the sky met the gray water, toward whatever waited for me next. By the time I reached home from Norfolk, the rain had turned from steady to punishing. Cold. Metallic drops struck the windshield like shards of steel. The road blurred into a river of lights, the world outside shrinking into streaks of silver and gray. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, except for the warm glow in the living room. Ethan was waiting. He didn't speak right away. His shoulders were tense, hands clasped together like he was holding something fragile. When he finally looked up, there was a resignation in his face that I had come to recognize, a man already surrendering before the battle had begun. "Dad called," he said. "He wants us both at the Naval Ethics Conference next week. He's the keynote speaker." The words hung in the air like a threat. I didn't move. My eyes drifted to the coffee table, where a thick cream envelope rested beside a half-finished drink. The Navy seal gleamed under the lamplight, the ink of Raymond's signature fresh and proud. I picked it up. The handwriting at the bottom was unmistakable. "Laurel may attend, if she still remembers professionalism." I felt something dark twist inside me. My laugh came out dry, brittle. It startled even me. He wants to humiliate me again. Ethan didn't answer. He sat very still, watching me the way one watches a fuse burn closer to the dynamite. "When you said you didn't know what happened that night," I asked, "was that because you were afraid? Or because you agreed with him?" His voice was almost a whisper. "It doesn't matter now." But it did. It mattered more than anything. I looked at the man I'd shared my home with, realizing how many truths could die quietly in a marriage if both people pretended they weren't there. I placed the invitation back on the table, the paper now warped slightly from my wet hands. I didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Raymond wasn't just inviting me, he was staging something, and I was supposed to play my part again as the silent one. Later that night, while the storm rattled the windows, my phone rang. The number was blocked. Static filled the first few seconds before a voice broke through, distorted but unmistakable. "They know you have the device. Don't meet him alone. Marjorie." "Who's they?" I asked, but the line went dead. The only sound left was wind, long, hollow, endless. I stared at the phone, heart pounding. A few seconds later, an email appeared in my inbox. No sender name, no subject line, just 6 words. "Stop digging, or your husband will pay." My stomach dropped. I looked toward the stairs where Ethan's shadow stretched faintly against the wall. For a moment, I wondered if they were already inside the house. I went to my study and locked the door. My hands moved on instinct, pulling files from the cabinet, spreading papers across the desk. I opened the Fireline dossier again, the one I'd copied from Raymond's archive. As I flipped through the last pages, I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a digital signature at the bottom of the official report. The font was clean, formal. "Approved, Commander L. Whitford." I stared at it for a long time, the letters blurring. Then I pulled out the original scan from the USB I'd taken. The signature there was different. Thicker strokes, a heavier pen, Raymond's hand. He had forged my name. He hadn't just blamed me. He'd written me into the lie. My pulse roared in my ears. I snapped a photo of both pages side by side and sent it to Marjorie with a short message. "If anything happens to me, send this to the press." Then I powered off the phone. The rain outside grew harsher, hammering against the roof like fists. I stepped out onto the porch. Across the street, parked just beyond the glow of the street lamp, was a black SUV. It had been there before, but tonight, the windows were rolled up tight, no license plate, no movement. Its outline glistened faintly under the rain. an animal watching from the dark. I didn't go back inside. I just stood there, rain soaking my hair, the chill biting through my clothes. For the first time, fear felt secondary to something else, numbness. The kind that comes when you realize there's no way back to the person you used to be. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the world hadn't calmed. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Unreadable strings of symbols. No sender info. Spam. Maybe. Or warnings. Then came the news. I was making coffee when the alert flashed across the TV screen. House fire in Norfolk. 1 dead. Identity pending. The location hit me first. Marjorie Street. I froze. The anchor's voice continued. Almost routine, cause under investigation, no foul play suspected. But I knew better. My phone vibrated once more. One last email. Sender, Marjorie Holt. The message contained only a file link labeled Backup Delta Tracker. My breath caught. She'd sent it before they got to her. I downloaded the file, my hands trembling. The progress bar crawled painfully slow. Outside, the street was eerily quiet. No wind, no rain, just the faint hum of distant traffic. When the transfer finished, I stared at the folder on my desktop. That small icon, an ordinary digital file, contained the truth that could burn everything down. Raymond's career, the Navy's myth, the last remnants of my silence. I felt the weight of it, heavier than any metal, any lie, any oath I'd ever been forced to live under. Behind me, Ethan appeared at the doorway, still in his robe. He looked at the computer screen, then at me. "What's that?" "Just work," I said, my voice even. He nodded, but his eyes lingered. I could tell he didn't believe me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house seemed too still, too clean. I kept expecting to hear the sound of tires outside or the hum of another car engine idling at the curb. At some point, I got up and stood by the window. The SUV was gone. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then, in the faint reflection of the glass, I saw something else. The red dot of a security camera, blinking faintly across the street. They weren't hiding anymore. I pulled the curtain shut and went back to my desk. The Delta Tracker backup sat open on the screen, its data encrypted and labeled with timestamps. I didn't play it yet. Not because I was afraid of what it would say, because I already knew. I thought of Marjorie's voice, low and steady. Those who tried didn't live long enough to testify. She had, in her way. And now it was my turn. I shut off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. Outside, the first light of dawn stretched pale across the horizon. The black SUV hadn't returned, but I knew they hadn't left either. People like that didn't stop watching. Not until they were sure silence was restored. I sat down again, opened the folder, and whispered to myself. Not as a vow, but as a reminder. This time, the silence belongs to me. The morning after the storm felt too quiet, too clean. Ethan wasn't in bed when I woke. His side was cold, the pillow undisturbed, as if he hadn't slept there at all. Downstairs, the house carried that unsettling stillness that follows a lie. Nothing out of place, yet everything felt wrong. On the kitchen counter sat a folded receipt, edges still damp from the rain that had seeped through his jacket. It was from Whitford Trust LLC. The transfer, $95,000. The signature, Ethan's. The account holder, Raymond. I stared at the printout until the numbers blurred. The note at the bottom read, "For preservation and security." The phrasing was clinical, but I knew what it meant. My husband had paid for silence, and silence, in this family, was never free. By noon, he still hadn't returned. The house felt heavier with every hour that passed, the ticking of the clock growing louder, the air growing thicker. When the doorbell finally rang, I almost didn't answer. Marianne stood there in her raincoat, holding a pie wrapped in foil and the same nervous smile she'd worn for years. Her perfume, something floral and old-fashioned, hit me before her words did. Laurel. I heard rumors. Her voice trembled. the way it always did when she came to deliver her husband's messages under the disguise of motherly concern. Please don't reopen old wounds. He's done enough for this country. I stepped aside, letting her in. The house smelled faintly of coffee and salt. She placed the pie on the counter, hands shaking slightly as she smoothed the foil. And what about the ones who died for his record? I asked. She froze, her face pale under the kitchen light. Her lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. When she finally did, her voice was almost a whisper. You don't understand. The Navy protects its own. There it was. The truth, dressed up as duty. I watched her leave a few minutes later, her small figure swallowed by the fog outside. The screen door slammed shut behind her, a sound too sharp, too final. I stood there, staring at the pie she'd left on the counter. Sweetness offered like a peace treaty built on denial. That evening, I returned to my desk. The backup Marjorie had sent was still unopened, sitting on my laptop like a dare. I hesitated only a second before clicking the file. The video began in static, grainy black and white. Then came motion, blurred figures, the inside of a cockpit, alarms blaring faintly in the background. The camera tilted, catching a man's arm as he shouted into a headset. Commander Whitford is still out there. Then Raymond's voice, calm, cold, final. Then cut her line. That's an order. The screen went white, metal screeched, wind howled, the feed died. I didn't realize I was crying until the tears hit the keyboard. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shock. It was something deeper, a grief I thought had already been buried. Hearing that order again was like reliving the moment I fell from the sky. Except this time, there was no storm to blame. I leaned back in the chair, pressing my palms to my eyes, breathing hard. Somewhere between guilt and rage, something in me hardened into resolve. The silence around him had been built from the bones of others, men lost, reputations buried, my own voice cut out. I wasn't going to let it stand any longer. Then the playback data flashed across the screen. Uploader E. Whitford. Time 2011 05 19 47 6. My breath caught. Ethan. He had uploaded the footage. He'd seen everything, saved it, and kept it hidden all these years. When he came home that night, the house was dark except for the lamp in my study. His face was drawn, rain dripping from his hair, his eyes tired in a way I'd never seen before. You knew, I said quietly. You knew he tried to kill me. He closed his eyes. I wanted to protect you, Laurel. But I couldn't fight him. You didn't protect me, I said. You buried me. He didn't argue. There was no defense left to make. He only nodded once, like a man accepting a verdict he'd long expected. Then he turned and walked upstairs, leaving a trail of water on the hardwood floor. When the sound of his footsteps disappeared, I shut the door. The silence in the house was complete now. Not peace, not safety, but the end of pretending. I sat at the desk, opened my inbox, and searched for the message I had ignored for years. The one from the journalist who had died in that car accident. It was still there, untouched. The subject line. They lied about Fireline. My hands trembled as I opened it. The body of the email was short. One line. If you ever find the black box, don't go alone. I stared at the words until they burned into my vision. Outside, wind began to pick up, rattling the windows. The tide was high again, waves slapping against the rocks beyond the yard. I could smell salt through the cracks in the frame. I minimized the email and opened the folder Marjorie had sent. There was a small note buried in the metadata, one she must have hidden intentionally. Auto-stream link enabled. She hadn't just saved the evidence. She had built a trigger. The moment I opened the files publicly, they would broadcast everywhere, live, untraceable, unstoppable. My chest tightened. Marjorie had known she wouldn't live long enough to see it. She'd made sure I would. I leaned my head against the glass, eyes closed. The sound of the sea was deafening, crashing hard enough to shake the window. Somewhere in that rhythm, I could almost hear another sound, faint, fragile, familiar. Mom, fly higher. My daughter's voice, echoing through memory, through the years I'd spent carrying her loss like a shadow. The voice that had kept me alive when silence almost consumed me. I opened my eyes. The reflection in the window looked different now, steadier, colder. The woman staring back at me wasn't afraid anymore. The system Raymond built, the one that protected men like him, thrived because people like me learned to keep quiet. But the web only worked if everyone stayed still. I wasn't still anymore. The storm outside cracked with thunder, shaking the air. I turned off the light, walked back to the desk, and stared at the drive sitting beside the keyboard. In less than a week, Raymond would stand before the Navy and the nation to preach about ethics, leadership, and integrity. I would be there too. Not to listen, to end the silence. 3 days before the conference, I woke in the middle of the night to a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt watched, the kind of stillness that waits. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 2:14 a.m. Through the slats of the blinds, a faint shape cut against the darkness outside. A black SUV sat across the street, parked where the streetlight didn't quite reach. No license plate. Windows tinted darker than glass had any right to be. I reached for the binoculars I used when I still spent nights tracking flight patterns out of habit. There was someone inside, motionless, not reading, not on the phone, just sitting, waiting. They weren't hiding. They wanted me to see them. I stayed there for a long minute, my heart beat loud in my ears. Then I turned away, went downstairs, and tried to steady my hands long enough to pour some water. That was when my phone buzzed on the counter. One message, no name attached. You think you're saving lives. You're burying your husband. The words were clean, typed in the calm of someone who already believed they'd won. I froze. The refrigerator's hum was the only sound in the house. I looked toward the stairs. Ethan's side of the bed had been cold when I woke. He wasn't there now. Upstairs. His office door was slightly ajar. A thin strip of blue light spilling across the carpet. His laptop was open, the cursor blinking on a folder labeled Legacy Trust. I clicked it. Inside were contracts, long, dense legal language, and company headers I recognized. A 20% transfer of Whitford Tech shares to a defense conglomerate with deep ties to the Navy. The same name appeared again and again. Admiral Raymond Whitford, consultant of record. My throat went dry. The signature line at the bottom belonged to Ethan. He had signed it. A sale masked as a safeguard. Silence exchanged for stability. I printed the contract, folded it carefully, and slid it into my jacket pocket. When I turned, headlights flashed across the window, a car pulling into the driveway. Ethan walked in a minute later, soaked through, his shirt clinging to his shoulders. He didn't look surprised to see me standing there. His eyes darted briefly toward his office before settling on mine. How long have you known they're watching me? He didn't answer. You married me to protect his image, didn't you? Laurel, please, say it. He swallowed. I'm sorry. 2 words. Soft as dust, and somehow heavier than anything he'd ever said to me. When he went upstairs to shower, I sat at the kitchen table, listening to the pipes rattle. I thought about every time I'd mistaken compliance for love. How protection, in this family, always meant control. By the time he came back down, I was already at my desk, writing a message to Marjorie. If I don't make it to D.C., you know what to do. Upload the whole archive. The truth will fly. I hit send. At sunrise. The email still showed unread. I called her cell, straight to voicemail. I tried again. Then again. By the 3rd ring, the line said what I already knew. Out of service. When I opened the front door to get the morning paper, a small envelope was wedged under the threshold. Plain. No return address. My stomach turned cold. I tore it open. Inside was a photo of me meeting Marjorie in Norfolk, taken from a long distance. The angle was professional. Telephoto lens, steady hand. Behind the photo was a slip of paper. She won't talk again. Neither will you. I crumpled the paper until my palm hurt. For the first time, fear felt clean. It had purpose. It wasn't about dying. It was about losing anyone else to his lies. I went upstairs, turned on my laptop, and created a folder labeled Project Aurum. I knew what that name meant to me, to him, to the world that had taken her. Inside the folder, I began collecting everything: emails, signatures, contracts, voice clips. The last file I added was titled Fireline Sequence Final. I encrypted it, set a double authentication code, and for the password typed my daughter's name, followed by the date she died during that training exercise Raymond had approved. While the files transferred, I searched the Navy's technical archive. The equipment listed in her accident report used the same faulty sensor design as the Fireline mission, the same model, produced by the same Whitford subsidiary. He hadn't made one mistake. He'd built an entire pattern of them and buried each one. I sat there a long time, the cursor blinking on the final line of my notes. Then I pressed record on my phone. My voice came out steady. "If you find this, remember, silence has a cost." I saved it and tucked the recorder inside the envelope with the contract. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every creak in the walls sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind like breathing just outside the window. Around 3 a.m., I went downstairs again, drawn by something I couldn't name. The living room lights were off. The curtains moved faintly, though the air was still. I crossed to the window and looked out. The SUV was gone. For a second, I thought maybe it had finally ended, that the threat had passed. But when I turned back, I saw the faint smudge of muddy footprints on the porch, leading away from the steps toward the driveway. On the hood of my car, a new streak of wet dirt, like someone had leaned there, watching. I flipped on the floodlight. Nothing. Just the restless sway of the trees. But the marks were real. That's when I noticed the pattern of the boot prints. Military issue. Standard Navy design. Not reporters. Not strangers. His men. Men trained to follow orders. Even after retirement. Even if the order was to keep me quiet. I didn't bother waking Ethan. What would be the point? I walked into my office, shut the door, and pulled the blinds. The fear that had haunted me for months was gone, replaced by something sharper, heavier. Anger had turned to purpose. They could watch, they could threaten, but the one thing they'd never expect was that I'd already stopped running. The truth was out of their hands now. Project Aurum was backed up on 3 encrypted drives, 2 hidden, 1 scheduled to upload automatically in 72 hours. When I finally crawled back into bed, the SUV was nowhere to be seen. Still, I kept my eyes open until dawn, as light crept through the blinds, painting thin stripes across the floor. I realized the fear had burned itself out. In its place, something quieter settled in. Resolve. Raymond had built his empire on the illusion that people like me would stay small, compliant, grateful to be ignored. But the silence he'd relied on was cracking, one secret at a time. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to listen. Outside, the world was waking. Inside, I was too. Whatever waited in Washington, I wasn't walking into his trap anymore. I was walking straight through it. 2 days before the conference. The rain came down hard, angry, relentless, like the sky had been holding its breath too long. I couldn't sleep. Every drop against the window felt like a countdown. When the doorbell rang close to midnight, I froze. No one visited this late, not anymore. The second ring came sharper, almost desperate. I pulled on a sweater and opened the door. Mary Ann stood there, soaked through, her hair plastered to her temples, her hands trembling as she clutched her handbag. The porch light caught the streaks of water on her face. Some were tears, some weren't. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. "Don't go to Washington, Laurel, please. He'll destroy himself if you do." "He already did," I said, her eyes filled with fresh tears. "You don't understand. He's dying." The words hit harder than I expected. For a moment, all I could hear was the rain beating the roof, the steady rhythm of something falling apart. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photograph. Raymond in a hospital gown, tubes in his arm, his expression defiant even under fluorescent light. His hand rested on his chest, where a monitor cable hung, like he was daring death to move first. "The doctors found something," she said. "His heart. He doesn't have much time." I stared at the photo, at the man who had rewritten the truth until it became scripture. A man who had built his empire on other people's silence, now kept alive by machines that refused to let him leave. "If I expose him now," Marianne whispered, her voice breaking, "it'll kill him." "Do you want him to die a hero?" I asked, "or live long enough to tell the truth?" Her composure collapsed. Tears slid down her cheeks as she shook her head. "You'll break this family apart. Then maybe it can finally rebuild on something real." She covered her mouth with one trembling hand, as if trying to catch the sob before it escaped. For a moment, I thought she might slap me. Instead, she turned, shoulders shaking, and walked out into the rain. I watched from the doorway as her car disappeared down the street, taillights glowing red through the curtain of water until they vanished completely. The last thread of mercy between me and this family had just snapped when the house went quiet again. I sat at my desk and opened the Project Aurum folder. The screen glowed pale blue in the dark. A line of text blinked on the corner of the window. "Upload scheduled. Backup initiated." Before I could breathe, another notification popped up. "Security alert. Unauthorized access detected." Source: Whitford Legacy Server. He knew. Raymond had found the files. My phone lit up before I could even close the window. Ethan's name flashed across the screen. I hesitated, then answered. He was shouting over the sound of rain and traffic. "Dad knows." "Laurel!" He called me. He said if you go through with this, he'll release your record. He'll ruin you before you can even speak. "Let him," I said quietly. "It's the first true thing he'll ever say." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear him breathing hard, the weight of something unsaid pressing against the line. Finally, his voice cracked. "I took the money, Laurel, from him. He said it was to keep you safe, but it wasn't. It was to make sure I told him where you went, what you were doing." I closed my eyes. The sound of the rain seemed to dull for a moment, replaced by a cold stillness in my chest. "You thought you were keeping me safe," I said. "You were keeping me small." He didn't argue. The silence stretched until I hung up. Outside, thunder rolled low and deep, the kind that shook the windows. I walked to the living room, the floor creaking beneath my feet. Through the sheer curtains, I saw it, the black SUV again, sitting across the street like an animal waiting for command. This time, its headlights were on. Two pale orbs of light cut through the rain, unwavering. A warning. I didn't flinch. I just stood there, staring back until lightning flashed, and the reflection of my face appeared faintly on the glass. Wet hair, tired eyes, but no fear left to show. I turned away, walked upstairs, and opened the closet. Hanging behind old coats was my flight jacket, the one I hadn't worn since the day I left the Navy. The leather was faded, the patch on the shoulder peeling, but it still fit when I slipped it on. I grabbed the USB from the drawer and tucked it inside the pocket. Back at my desk, I uncapped a black marker and wrote across my wrist. Steady and bold. Tomorrow, the sky will hear me. My hand didn't shake. The rain eased for a moment, just long enough for a new sound to break through, the vibration of a message on my phone. The number was hidden, the text short. Live stream ready. When you plug it in, the world watches. I froze. The words pulsed on the screen, a final echo of Marjorie's work. She had built it into the archive, the safety net neither of us could admit we needed. It meant she'd known this moment would come, that I might have to stand alone. Lightning flared again, illuminating the room for a second. I caught my reflection in the window, the old jacket, the determined set of my jaw, somewhere beneath the exhaustion and grief. I could feel it. the clarity that only comes when there's nothing left to lose. Down the hall, I heard Ethan moving in his sleep, restless but unaware. I stood there for a while, listening to the rain hit the roof, counting the seconds between each flash of lightning. This wasn't courage. It was inevitability. Raymond thought he could control the narrative forever, but he'd underestimated what silence does to a person. It builds pressure, layer by layer, until the truth becomes louder than fear. I powered off the computer, grabbed my bag, and turned off the light. The glow from the streetlights filtered through the blinds, streaking across the floor like bars. For a brief second, I thought of my daughter, her laugh, her voice whispering through memory. "Mom, fly higher," I whispered back. "I will," and for the first time in years, I meant it. The morning air in Washington felt too still for what was coming. The Hay Adams Hotel loomed above Lafayette Square like a polished relic of power, its white stone walls gleaming under a pale winter sky. Flags lined the entrance, snapping in the wind. Inside, the grand ballroom was a sea of brass and blue, metals glinting beneath chandeliers, conversations clipped and careful. I arrived early. My gray suit blended into the crowd, neutral enough to be invisible. No one looked twice at me, the quiet wife of Ethan Whitford, a face that belonged to the periphery. My name badge said nothing of who I used to be, only who they believed I was. That anonymity felt like armor. The stage was framed with banners, leadership and integrity in modern command. Rows of officers filled the room, their postures straight, their applause ready. When the music began, those familiar ceremonial notes I'd once marched to, my stomach twisted. Then Raymond appeared, framed by light, walking toward the podium with his slow, deliberate stride. He was smaller than I remembered, his skin gray under the spotlights, but the arrogance was still there, stitched into his spine. He gripped the lectern with one trembling hand, adjusting his tie with the other. His voice, when it came, was the same commanding baritone that once carried across flight decks and command rooms. "Leadership," he began, "means knowing when to act and when to retreat." The audience chuckled on cue. The rhythm was rehearsed, even his pauses were premeditated. I felt the hum in my ears, the echo of helicopter blades in fog, the sound that had haunted me for years. Then, just as the applause began to fade, he looked down at me. That same patronizing half-smile crossed his lips. "Not everyone can wear the uniform," he said, his tone casual, practiced. "Some confuse emotion with courage." The laughter that followed was small but sharp, enough to slice through me. I stood. The scraping of my chair on marble echoed louder than it should have. Heads turned. A few whispers rippled through the crowd. I walked toward the auxiliary microphone by the stage. The carpet felt endless beneath my heels. Raymond's voice faltered when he saw me approach. "Commander Laurel Whitford," I said, my voice steady. "U.S. Naval Air Rescue. Operation Fireline, 2011. The room went silent. For a heartbeat, the world stopped moving. The spotlight found me, harsh and white. I could see the recognition dawning in faces across the room, some shocked, some uneasy, others pretending not to know the name that had been erased from the reports. Raymond froze, the color draining from his face. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the small silver USB, and held it up. Then I plugged it into the presentation computer beside him. The projector blinked. The screen behind him flickered from his PowerPoint slides to a grainy audio log. The room filled with static, wind, and voices. "Abort rescue. Visibility 0. No retrieval. Sir, survivors still transmitting. We'll report it mechanical." Raymond's own voice filled the hall. Cold, certain, commanding. A wave of murmurs broke through the crowd. Raymond lunged toward the console, shouting, "Cut the feed! That's classified!" I stepped closer to the microphone. My words came slow, deliberate. "You taught us honor." "Admiral, what kind of honor abandons 9 men to die so a report stays clean?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, from somewhere near the front, a voice cracked through it. My son was on that chopper. Another followed. Mine too. The noise grew, chairs scraping, people standing, whispers turning into shouts. Raymond staggered back, clutching the edge of the podium, his composure fractured. "You think silence is loyalty?" I said. But silence killed them. And it killed my daughter too. Every eye in the room was on him now. The man they had worshipped, the symbol of discipline and duty, stood small and cornered, under the weight of his own legacy. From the back, Ethan's voice rose, raw and shaking. "She's telling the truth. I saw the files." He made her take the blame. All heads turned toward him. He stood pale under the lights, rain-soaked from his rush through the doors, but resolute for once in his life. The noise crescendoed, reporters lifting phones, flashes exploding, whispers turning into outrage. A cameraman near the aisle pointed his lens straight at the stage. Raymond tried to speak but choked on the words. "You'll destroy this family!" I met his eyes. "No. Admiral, I'm saving it from what you turned it into." I unplugged the USB and placed it on the podium, right in front of him. He reached out, hands shaking, clutching it like something sacred. I turned away. Behind us, the projector blinked again. Across the giant screen, a new message appeared, bold and impossible to miss. "Live stream active, 2.3 M, viewers." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The broadcast wasn't contained in that room. It was everywhere, every screen, every device connected. Marjorie's final safeguard, her final act. Raymond stumbled back as if the air had left him. I could see the realization in his eyes, the empire of lies unraveling in real time. I stepped back to the microphone one last time. My voice came softer now, but it carried to every corner of the hall. "This isn't revenge. It's remembrance." Then I walked off the stage. The sound behind me was unlike applause or outrage. It was the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath, watching a monument crumble. As I passed through the exit, I glanced back once. Raymond was slumped in his chair, head bowed, the USB still in his trembling hand. The great man reduced to a truth he could no longer command. Outside, the air was cool, the rain gone. Sirens echoed somewhere in the distance. I walked down the marble steps and into the streetlight's glow, the chaos fading behind me. The truth was no longer mine alone. It was free. 3 weeks later, every major paper in the country carried his face on the front page. Admiral Whitford, under investigation for dereliction of duty. The headlines were clinical, stripped of emotion, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. A nation finally seeing the cracks in its own mythology. Retired officers began to speak, first one, then another, and then a flood. Men who had once toasted him at banquets now wrote open letters admitting what they'd buried for years. Emails poured into my inbox from veterans I had never met. They thanked me for letting the truth breathe again, for proving that silence was not loyalty, but complicity. Ethan left his father's company quietly, the way a man sheds a uniform that no longer fits. He came to see me one afternoon at the coastal center I'd started helping rebuild, a modest hangar repurposed for rescue training. His voice was low, almost uncertain. "I was weak, Laurel, but you made me remember who I wanted to be." I didn't answer. Forgiveness wasn't something you gave. It was something a person earned by who they became afterward. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the Navy, formal, precise. Raymond had been stripped of every advisory title, every honorary distinction. But at my request, there would be no trial, no imprisonment. In my petition, I had written one line that mattered. Prison won't teach integrity. Facing cadets every day might. The scandal didn't vanish, but it stopped bleeding. People moved on. The noise faded into headlines about new wars, new leaders. 3 months passed. Then, one morning, an anonymous link appeared in my email. No message, no subject, just a file. I opened it. Raymond stood at a podium in a Naval Academy lecture hall. Older, smaller. His uniform replaced by a plain gray suit. His voice trembled, but didn't falter. If you ever think silence keeps you safe, remember, it buries others. The cadets before him sat in absolute stillness, no applause, no questions, just the sound of truth finally landing where it should have lived all along. He closed his eyes when he finished, and for the first time, I believed he understood the word honor. A week later, a letter came in Marianne's handwriting. The paper smelled faintly of her perfume, the edges smudged from tears. You saved him from dying a hero's lie. Now he's finally just a man who can learn. I folded it carefully, set it on the windowsill, and looked out toward the water. The sea shimmered silver beneath the morning sun. For the first time in 14 years, the wind no longer sounded like a cry for help. It just sounded like peace. 1 year later, the air in Oregon carried the kind of quiet that doesn't demand explanation. Just mountains, wind, and the steady hum of propellers. The hangar doors of Orem Air Response opened to the dawn, revealing a row of rescue aircraft gleaming under pale gold light. My name wasn't on the building, but it didn't need to be. The mission was enough. Every morning, I flew with the team, men and women who'd once been written off, now rebuilding something real in the skies above the Cascades. Our call sign was painted in bold red on every fuselage, so others may return. The mountains below still held snow. The rivers still cut through them like veins of light. Up here, there were no ranks, no medals, no lies. Only the work, the wind, and the weight of responsibility I'd chosen again. Before takeoff, I checked my email. One new message. Subject, Lecture 3, The Cost of Silence. Sender, Naval Academy Media Unit. I opened it. The video began with the familiar hum of a classroom mic. Raymond stood at the front, gray-haired now, his uniform replaced with a simple suit. His voice was rough, but clear. Abort rescue. No one's coming out alive. He paused, his eyes scanning the room of cadets. Then he said, softer this time, if you ever hear those words, be the one who says no. I closed the laptop. Outside, the engines roared to life, wind sweeping through the open door. Control tower. This is Commander Whitford. Request clearance. A moment's pause. Then the reply crackled through my headset. Orem 01, cleared for takeoff. I pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft lifted, wheels leaving the runway, rising into a sky streaked with sunlight. The coastline spread out beneath me. Ocean, forest, horizon, all of it smaller, softer. The wind rushed against the glass, carrying an echo I'd almost forgotten. The sound of laughter, high and free. My daughters. I reached up and touched the old insignia pinned to my collar, once stripped away, now gleaming again in the light. We did it, baby, I whispered. We made the truth fly. The sky opened wide before me, no fear, no burden, just the quiet freedom of someone who had already told the whole truth, and finally, could fly again.